Let's go. Welcome everybody that I can't see, but that can hear me and my co-host Klaus Kunz. I'm very excited to welcome everybody to this webinar in the virtual form. The topic that we're going to discuss today is shareholder engagement and also some of the key takeaways from the shareholder meetings that have already been held. But also we're going to be talking about what companies in particular can do if their shareholder meeting is still coming up. Or maybe in the longer term in terms of engaging with their investors. My name is Angelika Horstmeier. I work for Alliance Advisors. I'm head of corporate services there, and we help companies and investors get together in these turbulent times. And I'm pleased to introduce my co-host, Klaus Kunz, Dr. Klaus Kunz. He's the head of ESG strategy at Bayer. And maybe, Klaus, you can also tell us what you do at Bayer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angelika. It's really cool to be part of this chat that we have today. I really love it. It's an unscripted conversation. I think that's really the format of the future. And I think we have all too many of those scripted versions. So yes, I'm leading ESG strategy at Bayer. I have been many times in the US recently where ESG has an increasingly negative connotation in many perspectives. For me, ESG is a mechanism which helps to transform a sustainability strategy of a company into an investable framework. So what we discussed today perfectly fits into this. And other than that, I'm almost 22 years with Bayer. Research, development, project management, sustainability, most of the time in the crop science division.
I think you're the perfect example, Klaus, of what companies can do in the future to set up with their terms of with their engagement with investors and actually addressing these critical questions that are coming. And you know, we'll get to this later. Maybe we'll start a little bit looking back at the beginning of the year and looking at the shareholder meetings that have already been held in Germany in particular, what investors have done, what investors are still doing, what we are observing in my role as working on shareholder meetings and also speaking to investors as well as companies in the preparation of these shareholder meetings. So what we've seen is that quite a lot of shareholders, so investors in particular, have become quite stringent on certain topics. They are becoming more detailed in their guidelines that they're applying to shareholder meetings in Germany, in particular regarding board elections, wanting to see more disclosure, wanting to see how much time commitments this board member might have for other mandates that they have, looking at the discharge of a supervisory board. This is now tends to be a framework for investors to vent any sort of frustration or any sort of criticism that they might have that they can't put onto another agenda item. So if it's not relating to a board election or a capital increase or something like that, it tends to end up at the discharge where the supervisory board is made responsible for certain things, such as not doing enough reporting on climate change, not doing enough in being responsive to shareholder dissent, not doing enough in keeping the board independent enough, or committees independent enough. This is also an important topic, or in general, you know, just anything where investors want to vent. That's where we see it. And I think the other topic that's also, of course, on everybody's mind that's preparing for their shareholder meeting, and also what has been on our mind here, which is the virtual version of a meeting. You know, I think in the old days, pre-pandemic, we would have been standing on a stage and my stage fright would have got the worst of me. And, you know, here we are sitting in our living rooms, which is very nice. And we're holding a virtual webinar. But virtual shareholder meetings have a different connotation where you have, of course, the ease of it. Everybody can participate from, you know, from the luxury of their own home if they want to. But also shareholders are not necessarily able to exercise their rights the way that they want to by being present, by being in front of the board, the supervisory board, being able to ask questions live, feeling the energy of the answers. And I think this is something where we've seen some dissent, especially for the first shareholder meetings that have been held this year already, is that there are some negative votes coming through, in particular from Germany-based investors, but also some French investors. And that's because the proposal for the virtual shareholder meeting might not have been all-encompassing. So, keeping the shareholder rights the same as they were if it was a physical shareholder meeting is something that's super important. It's something to be considered. Also, I think the other topic that's very important is the length of time that you're introducing this into your articles of association. I think, anything more than 2 years will get quite a lot of criticism just because there is uncertainty about the future. And, ultimately, I think a lot of shareholders want German companies in particular to go back to the in-person format. Anyway, enough about that. So let's talk about also about some of the other topics that are on everybody's mind. And we are talking about investors being stricter in their guidelines, engaging with companies, new investors coming up and talking to companies about very specific subjects, about the salary of the CEO, for example. And these are investors also that maybe the company doesn't particularly know, that the company doesn't have a relationship with. And it's something that's quite strange then at the end of the day, when you get a request coming in and somebody wants to speak to the chairman of the supervisory board or the chairwoman of the supervisory board. How do you deal with that? And how do you deal with these sort of critical questions? I'm going to come back to you, Klaus. How do you deal with that when they come to you? I think you welcome them, right?
I welcome them, absolutely. I mean, just a couple of words on shareholder meetings. Ours is coming in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert. I have been just present in the last two. But what you say, I find absolutely true, is transparency and disclosure is a must. Is a complete must. I have to say, while the last one which we had was virtual, it took a very, very long time, but we were reading out basically all the critical questions, and we were showing all the critical movies which we got, sometimes quite painful statements, but honestly speaking, while it was taking an enormously long time, I found it very good, because I mean, if you turn down questions, you are already on the wrong track. So on the other hand, what also became clear to me is that the annual shareholder meeting is not necessarily the best place to begin a detailed conversation, because it's actually already too late. So engagement has to start much earlier. And what I think we learned over the last couple of years is that especially the critical conversations have to take place. And we have to invite people for critical conversations, and we need to address the really controversial topics up front. We have quite some at Bayer. Most of them are related to the ag business after the acquisition which we have made. So yes, annual shareholder meetings, we will see new formats. We want to explore more engagement with shareholders in the meetings, while there are legal frames which we can't just ignore. In Germany, I think they're quite rigid. But for me, the engagement has to start before. Talking to you, Angelika, and to anybody else who can give us critical feedback on, Klaus, I hear you saying this, or I hear a company saying that. I don't like it. Can you please explain? That's key.
That's it. I think a lot of times, the shareholder meeting, like you say, it's the last resort. It's like the cure, as we say in German. It's already, everything has been done, and you are just approving things also that have happened in the year before, where you're discharging and where you're approving the dividend, etc. And I think the engagement process, it has to be a year-round conversation like you have with your mother, where it is something that is, critical at times, but also very positive. But it's a relationship that you build. And the more you build on this, the more effort you put into it, the more you reap from it, because there will be some really good ideas. There will be some critical ideas as well. There will be some things that you haven't even thought about, and that maybe that you don't have the answer to, but you can come to the answer ultimately over the process of it.
I like your example of the conversation with your mother, because I think you can learn a lot from your conversations with your parents, or being a parent, and how you can do it right and how you can do it wrong. Because what is needed is a conversation, is a real conversation. And many parents, me included, of course, I have 3 boys, they fall into the trap of teaching all the time, or even preaching all the time. And I mean, one of my learnings, especially talking to boys which are then 16, 17, 18, 20, they have zero interest to be taught by me. And this is something where the industry, I think, has to make major steps out of traditional behaviors. You cannot imagine how often I heard we need to educate the public better. And then really, you know, nobody wants to be educated by us. It's the wrong approach. It is, how can we connect? How can we reconnect to people who have a critical view? Just as an example, and that's an example from the old Bayer history, and not from, for example, from Monsanto legacies. From Bayer, we had the topics with the pollinators and the insecticides. And I was in charge for many years to run this issue management team. And, you know, just trying to tell others that we are right and they are wrong, while there was a weekly publication by scientists which showed in laboratory conditions that there were effects on bees. Just saying, yeah, but we have studies under real life conditions which clearly show safety is possible. That didn't work anymore after a while. We had to make a step, and we decided to disclose all our regulatory data at one point of time, more or less voluntarily, because we realized it's us who has to make a step. And you know, just teaching and preaching and educating is not the way. It's a conversation.
Indeed. And I think it's also from the other way around, right? So your investors, they are only a part of the family, right? So that there's a lot of other stakeholders that are also a part of the whole story. Your employees are your partners, your suppliers, your you know, of course, whoever you're affecting. But I think also if you turn it around to the investor side, and you look at a company such as BlackRock, right, one of the largest investors in the world, or the largest investor in the world, do they have the idea, or do they know exactly what Bayer needs to do in terms of engagement, in terms of reporting, in terms of whatever it is, that the risk management that you need to do in order to be the best at everything? There is no solution to this question. There is just a pathway that you walk together, and you come to some sort of compromise in a way that you look at what is the best we can do in the situation that we are in, right? And also, how can we manage the future, but how can we mitigate risks, having learned from the past, having learned from mistakes. There are mistakes everybody makes, but also how can we move into the future and actually be learning from it, be more open about it. And I think also, you know, that is the magic of how everything comes together, because the company isn't supposed to be the teacher, neither is the investor, but what is teaching is the coming together, exchanging views and saying, you know what, I'm really struggling with this, or, you know, we are starting this reporting now and we are disclosing this on the website, but maybe you as my investor can also tell me, have you seen some other really good examples? You know, have you got some ideas? Are you willing to be my sparring partner rather than my offensive opposite? And I think that's where the magic begins, and also that's where a successful shareholder engagement on all topics really begins.
Because you create a win-win situation. And it's my call all the time to investors. I mean, you can look at companies like Bayer and wait for miracles to happen, or regulations to run the show, or you join and make your points. Joining means you also make a financial case for me that I can show to my leadership, like this company invests because they want to have ESG conversations, or they invested after they had ESG conversations with us, and we did a couple of things they really wanted us to do. And we had a number of these interactions, which I really love, because I don't want to make, you know, best friends in this webinar here, but investors are such a nice group to talk to, because they basically display all the concerns of their clients straight, but not with necessarily super negative intentions, but they are just concerned, and that's fine. And if you're not able to address and answer the questions, we have a problem, and we just need to understand that we have a problem if we cannot answer the questions properly in their language, which is also resonating to the investor and to the client. So this is why this interaction is from the first second onwards fruitful, because we very often realize that we use the wrong language, very often too technical language to describe things which nobody can understand except super experts. And And then also we get a lot of questions. Some of them we can clarify. Most of the questions are around, can you please disclose? You say you have the best policies on sustainability. Where is it? Then there's an automatic reaction like, oh no, we cannot disclose. And then you think twice and you realize actually we can disclose. And we disclose a lot of things which we haven't disclosed in the past, because it's the foundation of trust is open disclosure. And I think that is something in this century, hiding is no way. It's just the past.
No. You've got to get into the offensive and get
Yes.
out there and take the good with the bad. I think also it's something that you just said, Klaus, and I think that's also what we're seeing in terms of the voting behavior of investors is the asset owners actually coming through and asking for more disclosure or actually engaging rather than the investment managers. So there's been a lot of articles about pass-through voting from the passive funds, and this is affecting quite a lot of the large shareholders. BlackRock and State Street are doing it now, where they offer their asset owners pass-through voting. So I can come as a money giver and I can bring my own agenda. It may be something completely separate from what the BlackRock story might be, or whoever is my investment manager, but I can come to you directly and I can say, you know what, Klaus, this is really what's concerning me, and I want to talk to you about it. Have you noticed that this is actually happening already, or is it something that is not quite arrived yet?
It has not so much, and I'm working in the ESG space where this might be even a little bit more.
Yeah.
Only partly we have realized this, but whatever, if it's the asset owner, or if it's the investor, if it's the investor, he or she will ask typically an assembly of the questions that he or she receives from their clients. So we get, as a matter of fact, we get so much more interactions, we get so much more questions. And for example, just as an example, last year we had red flags from rating agencies. Another learning, we can talk about how to deal with that on a different note. But when we were able to remove, for example, the red flag that we had from MSCI, we get really messages from investors that changes the business case of Bayer. And that is such an important message to our leadership.
Yeah, absolutely.
Such an important, super important message to our leadership in how to deal with these ratings. It is something for a company which is like Bayer, life science company, very technical, regulatory driven. The ratings are not comparable to regulatory risk assessments. This is what I keep on telling my own people, and perception is part of the assessments. And you can whine and complain about it until the cows come home, but it doesn't help if, for example, one company gets a red flag for something that 3 other companies are also selling. And we had the case, we were carrying 2 red flags for things that others were also commercializing. And in the beginning, we were desperate, and how can it ever be? But we were the inventors. And the inventor carries the reputation, and the reputation hammers through into the final rating. And that is something that you need to understand. And that also means that you need to address topics in a more proactive way if you are the leader, or even if you were the leader, because on some of those technologies, we are not even the market leaders anymore, but we carry the red flag of the inventor. So how to deal with that? Definitely educating and whining and complaining doesn't make sense. What we realized is connecting to the concern is the most important thing, and acknowledging there's a concern. I understand there's a concern. I understand why there's a concern. I'm part of your concern. I have been working on the topic, maybe more than you have seen. Is a different opening than you're wrong, or it's not only us, or whatever, all these type of things that we traditionally would like to say. And it costs, because the intuition is to say, no, this is wrong, this assessment. It doesn't help. So that's a cultural learning process that you need to go through. It's just maybe a recommendation. Any company trying to build a ESG strategy, the first step is always, and now I'm taking it a bit broader. The first step is don't do it because you're regulated to do it. Do it because you want to create an impact. And anything else will keep you smaller than you are. So, I mean, any company should look, where's my positive impact? We are working in agriculture. We can help to produce enough food, while we can help to reduce impact on climate change. That's very significant. So this is impact area and biodiversity. And then you need to define your commitments, and you need to execute and report so that people can believe you. But then you need to have a governance that people can see that this is constructed on super solid ground and not depending on individuals who are maybe leaving the company 1 year later. It must be embedded. And then the last part brings me back to where I started. And then you need to clean up the controversial topics, because whatever you do before, if you haven't addressed those, people will still potentially turn around and say, whatever you say, whatever you do, whatever you govern, very nice, it's all nice, but still you have these products in your portfolio and we don't like them, and periods. So that's the way I would always go, and make it really solid, and address controversial topics just upfront.
I think also that's a good way for the board ultimately to understand, right? So of course, all of the different questions that are coming in and some of the reporting that has to be done, you know, it's a lot of it is probably quite removed from what the board does on a daily basis. But also they need to have this sort of input. They need to have this pipeline of criticism also coming in,
yes,
in order to keep themselves in a way in line and also sharp as to what are the external risk factors that are coming our way. And then, you know, to see a success story, if you can improve your rating because you have understood, one, of course, the framework that you're being assessed on, and also that you're being made responsible for being the inventor for something that you might have sold off. That then also shows that the board a success story, right? Because it shows them that it's something that has been positively turned around. I think a lot of times, if it's engagement, not necessarily on environmental issues, but maybe it's engagement on, let's say, social issues, right? Where we're talking about maybe a little bit more about something that's quite close to everybody's heart, which is the pay package. So we look at the executive pay that's maybe compared to employee pay. Especially now we're in the cost of living crisis, everybody is counting the pennies. And, you know, of course, investors want to see that, you know, your executive board isn't necessarily reaping in the rewards from the company performing well, but also that the employees are also being compensated in the same way, not necessarily in the same number of zeros, but also in the same ratio and in the same effect. And I think that's where at least, you know, that's often where executive boards in particular become, of course, very respondent and see that there is room for improvement, and maybe there is also something that needs to be worked on, something that needs to be engaged on with investors, because of course, you know, if the vote comes against it and it's your own package, then it's not so nice. So you want to get some sort of understanding on it, but also it's an idea that is relatively new to the market, and it's something, you know, the disclosure also of the CEO pay ratio versus your normal employee, your regular employee. I think it's something that is going to be a part of the future as well, where you're being assessed on the social impact that you have, and, you know, not just internally with your employees, but also, of course, externally onto your communities.
Couldn't agree more. It's a little bit of a European thing, so limit in sustainability or ESG conversations on the environmental topic. And I have to say that I was quite surprised, because in investor conferences where I was one of the few investees being present or speaking, that's another thing which puts some question marks sometimes. It's like you are just talking to yourself about impact and where are these people who shall create the impact. In one of those conferences, I talked about sustainable agriculture, and then I get a lot of comments from the audience, all investors, like how sustainable agriculture should look like, and it's all directed to environment. And I don't know if I told this to you, but I really love to quote then the American farmer I met in the Midwest, in Missouri, who I asked him, Joe, is your farm sustainable? And he said, yes, absolutely. I'm in the 8th generation on my farm, which is apparently very sustainable because it's sustaining over 8 generations. But that's more the economic argument, which is more the American way to look at sustainability. How can finance people forget that sustainability has an economic dimension? So on that sustainable agriculture equitation that we were reframing, and we were really reframing this completely when we started in 2018 after the acquisition of Monsanto. The headline of our speeches was, "Now we are shaping agriculture," and didn't work. So the way to rephrase it, and we did it, and it was for the industry, I think, a change, was not to say we are feeding the world or we are shaping agriculture like we used to say in the past. It was a question: how can we feed a hungry planet without starving it? Plus, with business models which are attractive for the farmers and their next generations. And then you have people, profit, planet, all integrated in your framing, and everybody in the room is in. Everybody, the farmers in, the environmentalist is in, and those people who don't have enough food are also in. And I think that's the thing where you don't present yourself like the one and only company in this world which has all the solutions, but actually which has the challenge, understood the challenge. These are my personal observations and my personal tips. If you go into these conversations, if you work in a company like Bayer, don't start by saying you are super cool and you have all the answers and everybody loves the things in your company that you do. No, start with the challenge that you have.
That's it. And I think that's the top tip. And I think hopefully, well, we all know that Bayer is in quite an extreme situation. And also you've, maybe because of that situation, you've made such giant leaps in terms of your output and in terms of your engagement. I don't know if it's because of that or just because of the strategy of the company, but I think maybe some needs also have there is a must in the need. But I think, hopefully a lot of other companies don't have such extreme challenges in terms of the engagement that comes in terms of maybe also the press coverage and also other coverages. But I think it's definitely a lesson to be learned, and it's definitely something to be taken to heart as what we're talking about here is these investors and also the questions and also the topics. They will keep coming. They are always there. It's about a change of mindset, and the mindset has to change from, oh, no, don't come to me. I'm busy with my job. I don't need to talk to you. Just, vote in favor of me and that's it. But to actually say, hey, what is your concern? And is it something that I'm already doing, or is it something that maybe I can look out for? And, I don't really have the answer, but how can we shape the answer? And that is, I think that is where it really has to begin. And we are also seeing this across the world. It's not just in Germany, but with a lot of companies across the world really opening up and having to engage. Maybe again, this needs and must thing. We've seen it a lot with the climate proposals as well, but also it's changing the attitude internally, I think, of management as well as the supervisory boards, that there is actually a benefit to the engagement that you get from investors as well as other stakeholders. And I think something else that is very important to know is that this is not something that you do when there is a negative time, when there is a crisis, when there is a pandemic, or when there is something in the press that you need to be engaging on, or maybe something that's quite urgent that I need to talk to you about because I'm about to vote against it. But it's something that needs to be a year-round dialogue. If you are a long-term investor, of course, the short-term investors might have a slightly different agenda, but the medium to long-term investors, they're in it for not just for the money, but also because of where the money might be made, and that is the longer term strategy and also the ESG integration into that strategy.
Yeah, I learned when I met you in Stockholm a few weeks ago, a new word. It's greenwashing. It's a very good word actually, because it follows the greenwashing. First, you are very loud, promising things that you never can deliver, and then you stop talking about it, which is then greenwashing. And I think that is something where now you will see who are serious about things and who are not so serious about things, because now we come to the hard decisions. Because it was basically that we all started 5 years ago to move into the sustainability tracks, like 4, 6 years ago. And that means that now the low-hanging fruits are collected. So for the company promising to become carbon neutral, the easy decisions are done, now the hard decisions have to follow. And for us, the clear learning was again, coming to the challenge, scope 3, super challenging. Scope 1 and 2, we can manage. Scope 3, until now, we can't. That's it. I mean, that's what we need to talk about, and not how we great are super successful in doing the other things. I think what we actually really need to talk about is where are we struggling? And we are struggling with the scope 3, and we are not the only company. Everybody's struggling with scope 3. So this is something where I think we have the space to see that we win if we address our challenges. You can say it from a psychological point, make yourself vulnerable or whatever. And yes, that's true. I mean, just present yourself as a human being and not as a super robot machine.
No, and that's maybe also why we are so unscripted today in our webinar. And actually, it's just a conversation between two market participants rather than going off slides. That's why I've just read some of the questions that are coming in, Klaus. So I'm going to post something here. Yes. And to the audience, if we are not answering all of your questions, we will answer them after the webinar. I've just started reading them. There's quite a lot of them, so I'm just going to see if they can fit into our conversation now. So there's somebody here asking a couple of questions. One of them is, what's the relationship between your department, Klaus, and the IR department? Because, we're talking about this being an IR task, or is this something that maybe a separate department should do? And the other one is, and this sort of all leads into it, is also talking about, the year-round engagement. So the inbound that you get, Klaus. So you get shareholders, maybe also you can talk about the other stakeholders, but do you have this, are you part of ESG roadshows that the buyer IR team does, for example? Is that something that's also separate? How does it work at buyer? And, maybe then I can talk about what my experiences is with other clients.
Or you start.
Well, okay. So with a lot of clients, of course, they don't have so much staff to actually have two separate departments. So the IR team often is the receiver of the inbound question. So the investor comes to the IR team and they want to discuss something, or the IR team proactively reaches out to basically arrange maybe a virtual roadshow or a physical roadshow, talking about ESG topics, talking about guidelines, talking about maybe the current ESG strategy of the company, talking about maybe the path that they are on, and reporting on some of the successes, maybe also some of the challenges that they've had in the last year. And that's usually where it starts. And then you get other members of staff. So depending on how the company is set up, of course, it can be, a very, very small team, but it can also be a very large team. You bring in maybe the supervisory board. Usually shareholders would like to speak to the lead independent director, if there is one, or the chairwoman or chairman of the supervisory board. Sometimes the CFO comes in as well, if you're talking about some of the financials, but usually it's a non-financial roadshow. So it's IR, and usually it's the supervisory board that's part of it. So there's not a lot of companies that I know that have a separate ESG department that goes on their own roadshow. I think there should be some sort of correlation between IR.
Absolutely.
And sustainability, yeah.
And I think it's more historical that if you see it more coming from the sustainability area, and in most of the companies, sustainability used to be with public affairs in the past, and to a certain extent still is in Bayer. And if it is coming from that lens, then it was typically this area where these nice to do things were happening, while the investor relations is the hard stuff. And we have the team that we have investor engagement in the ESG space for a number of years. We are the little twin or the little sister or brother of the investor relations team. We have an excellent collaboration because we have complementary knowledge. We have our separate roadshows with my team, but we join their roadshows increasingly because they get increasingly number of questions. So I was in the big roadshow also with our head of the supervisory board early this year. I joined 12 of those one-on-ones with investors, and in 6 or 7, I got a lot of questions on ESG, which was much more than I expected. In 1 or 2 of them, it was more than 50% of the entire conversation. Plus, and that was the even nicer surprise, a lot of positive feedback on the efforts that we have made. So it's now seen, it becomes visible. So I think there's no logic place for ESG to be, because if you look at my working area, one part is investor engagement, the other part is performance reporting, which is the sustainability report, for example. And this will go, and everybody in Europe knows this, with the new CSRD coming up, sooner or later, it will be very, very closely linked to the accounting department, which is typically and traditionally responsible for the annual report. Because we will have a lot of sustainability reporting in the annual report of 25. So that's another area where you could say, should this whole sustainability reporting be separate, or should it be in the area of accounting? I think at this point of time, ESG is in that sense still special. And that's why I think it makes completely sense to have a setup like we have it. You can have all kinds of setups, because you need, both from the investor side and also from the reporting side, you need to have a specific skill set of people who can fly strategically high and overlook the impact of all these type of things, but also go really down into the weeds. What does it now mean, biodiversity accounting?
Yeah.
What does it actually mean? And then you can have a high-level conversation, but in the end of the day, the result at one point of time has to be that we understand how to count biodiversity, as we have been learning how to count dollars and euros. But it's much more complicated. And this is why I think ESG working in that space requires a finance view, a business strategic view, and a technical view at the same time, because you need to talk about these new measurements that nobody knows how they actually work. And that's why that's a rationale for me why it makes sense to keep an ESG group together, which is steering this with that double perspective, super high and in the weeds.
If you have the number of people that you can employ, right? It depends on how you're set up. I think also if we flip it and we flip it to the investor point of view, it used to be, let's say 10 years ago, the conversations, and back then I don't think really anybody went on anything but a financial roadshow. The conversation, if it was a conversation, it would always be with a governance analyst. It would be talking about, what is the independence rate of your supervisory board, and how much dividend, no, not even how much dividend are you paying, how many people are on the supervisory board, and how many of those are female, right? That used to be the conversation. Whereas nowadays, the conversation and also the titles of your opposite have changed, and it's ESG engagement specialist, for example. You get those now at BlackRock, and you still get governance specialists. So it's also about bringing every expertise together, because you can't be the expert in everything, but you have to bring in what you can. So also, of course, we have some ESG responsibility in the supervisory board. There's a requirement that there is somebody that's going to be responsible and also answerable to ESG queries, in theory, on the supervisory board, because this is becoming an important topic to talk about on a daily basis with investors as well as other stakeholders. And I think that's, in a way, that's the way that a company should then also organize themselves, is that you have some form of specialization into the subject. It's either in IR, it could be in reporting, it could be in communications, it could be wherever you feel necessary. But there is certainly, and also this is, you're being the perfect example of this, there's certainly a request for somebody like you to join the conversation at least, and to be able to talk about terms and topics that maybe IR can't talk about at that moment in time either, because it is something so specialized. So yeah. But
you would agree, Angelika, that in the investor companies you have the same struggle. I mean, it's basically a mirror of us.
Yeah.
We love to say, our people want to hear from me, how do investors think? And I say, well, investors are like us. They are all kinds of people. If people say everybody in buyer loves ESG, that's not true. No. And if people say all investors are super keen on ESG, that's also not true. I have been in conversations which I personally find quite depressing, where for hours there was not one single question on our new carbon business model in agriculture, not one single question. The word sustainability didn't even appear at one single time. This is part of the spectrum. It's important to understand the world that you are living in, but also the dynamics. And I think the dynamics are in favor of ESG, even if in the US the term ESG is so complicated to use, the direction is the same.
I think so. And I think, yeah, we all still have a lot to learn, and everyone has to decide for themselves how they are going to be setting themselves up, and also how they interpret some of the different topics as how important they are. But I think, yeah, this is why conversations like this are so helpful. One of the other questions that have come in is how do you engage with other stakeholders? So not just investors, but also other stakeholders in the company. Do you have a process for that?
Yeah, we have a process.
Yeah.
In our agricultural department, we have a separate stakeholder engagement team, for example, in the pharmaceutical division as well. And they cover all kinds of stakeholder groups. Of course, growers, but growers are typically our customer, and salespeople are talking to the growers. But then there are associations, there are NGOs, all kinds of stakeholders. I think it's really cool. I have the opportunity to be in a lot of these conversations. Just as an example, it was 2 weeks ago, I started the week in Washington, D.C. in a couple of offices, also of Republican senators. Very, very critical position on ESG, as we all can read in the newspapers, and for reasons. I mean, that's why we talk. And I ended the week on a Saturday on a panel of the Eine Welt organization in Germany, which is like agroecology, very anti-big agriculture, and I was basically the target for the entire audience. So I was going like the full spectrum from that you could imagine. Each of those conversations brings new insights. Each brings new insights. And if it's only that you understand which of my arguments resonate and which don't, that's important to understand, because otherwise you just talk to yourself. And that's what we have done as an industry over years. We were just sitting in the associations and we thought that's engagement, that we talk to our direct competitors. But that's the same perspective. So we were just copying, pasting our perspectives. You need really to talk to the people who have a very different perspective. And we have a process for that. We have a lot of capacities for this. And maybe something which I like, I don't know if you know, we a couple of years ago, it was a critical situation for the company. The company hired Matthias Berninger as a head of public affairs and sustainability. Matthias Berninger is a former member of the Green Party. And you can imagine that Matthias Berninger and our American colleagues from the Midwest had quite some different perspectives on agriculture in the company. And I think not many companies would do this, that you basically create such a conflict inside because you want to progress. And you have to progress. And if everybody's on the same page, you don't progress. That's something I find really cool. Also, that I'm sitting here and talk to you still means that the company accepts my point of view, which is not necessarily always 100%. At least the language which is used in the corporate brochures.
It doesn't have to be. And I think that's also, again, this is where solutions are found, when you are no longer of the same opinion and you can actually agree to disagree, but also listen to everybody around you. I think one of the last questions that have come in, I just need to make sure that we answer all these questions, is talking about, in general, so shareholder expectations and how, just going back to in a way, the title of this webinar. So looking at the shareholder engagement and also what are shareholder expectations, how can we sort of group them up, and what's our advice on trying to get everything under the same roof? It's so hard because everybody has a different guideline on this and a different opinion on that. And I think one thing, so maybe just from my perspective, what I've observed over the course of many years, but also over the course of maybe the most recent months. I've been in this business for also over 20 years, but in the most recent months, I've seen that a lot of investors are actually diverging from the guidelines that they used to apply. So this is maybe already starting to be an indication of the pass-through voting that I talked about earlier, where the asset owners actually take back the right to bring their own agenda and to, you know, potentially engage, but also to vote in their own way, which may be different to what the asset manager is doing at that moment in time, even though they might already be very critical and maybe might not be, you know, no longer the ISS or Glass-Lewis guidelines, but actually their own critical guidelines. And then the asset owner comes and says, no, actually, I have a completely different agenda. This is what I want to do. And this is so hard for any corporate to keep track of and to actually keep an eye on it, because you just don't know what's going to come your way come the shareholder meeting. As we already said, the shareholder meeting itself is already, it's a done deal by then. The shareholder meeting is only looking back at the last year. And if you haven't done any engagement, if you haven't done any conversations, or haven't had any conversations with your shareholders, then you are going to be surprised, because there's going to be a lot of, well, it's like a basket of fruit. It could be anything, right? So it's an abstain vote on this, and then a negative vote on that, and a positive vote, but all for very, very different reasons. And if you actually dig a little bit deeper, this is what we do, where we speak to the shareholders and we find out what their concerns are, what is the reason why you're potentially voting against an agenda item, let's say the discharge of the supervisory board. And they say, you know, Angelika, it's because the company is maintaining an independent board. Okay, that could be one of the reasons. But then the other reason could be because they haven't disclosed this ESG. They haven't got any ESG KPIs, for example, in their executive remuneration. Because of this, because of that, there could be so many different things. And I think this is where this year-round dialogue is the most important thing that you're going to reap benefits from come the AGM, but also come, of course, the future, because you're going to want to have a relationship, a meaningful relationship with your investor if they're a long-term investor, and potentially also the asset owner. You're going to be able to tell your board what are the concerns, maybe what are the forward-looking concerns, the risks that we're going to be facing, because I've heard from 5 of my 10 investors that they're going to start looking at this particular topic in the future. And then also I'm going to be able to explain to everybody come the shareholder meeting why there is potentially dissent, and it's completely reasonable, you know. And if I'm not reporting on something, or if I'm not integrating certain KPIs in my remuneration structure, then I just have to realize the fact that there is going to be some negative votes, and this is the reason why. And if you want to change something about that, you know where to start. It's not going to be with the investor, but it's going to be with your own, with what you are putting forward at that moment in time. But this is only in particular to this one. I think that's.
This is the perspective, now very personal. Klaus, being the child of East German refugees, I get very skeptical if I see 99% plus in any case. And that's something which I find sometimes a little bit strange in our society, that we all talk about diversity from the morning until the evening. But what do we mean with diversity? And in companies, still we want to have everybody expects 99% votes. What's the point? I mean, once again, I think that dissent is acceptable and okay if it's not complete dissent, like completely North and South Pole. But on specific topics, we will always have different opinions, and we should. And I think that's another step that we have to do as an industry, is to be just vocal and outspoken about the fact that every decision we make, every single decision we make comes with a trade-off. Every single decision has a gray shadow. And I think as a whole society, we need to learn this again, because we tend to think very binary. I think more than we used to do. We are just good and bad, good and bad. But of course, that's not the world, and that's not the truth. And if you want to really talk about, I come back to these examples in agriculture, whatever system you take, if it's more intensified, if it's less intensified, whatever you do has a trade-off. And it makes a lot of sense to address these trade-offs in an open way. And then you will have, in the end, if you make a voting, you will not arrive at 99% people voting for approach A versus approach B, because both come with, depending on your perspective, clear advantages and disadvantages. So this is something where I'm a bit more relaxed than maybe others about an 81% voting, because as I say, as somebody where parents grew up in a communist country, for me it's more a problem if there's a 99% voting.
It means that nobody had an opinion on it.
It seems like they are all, and we have seen it in politics, it can go 1 year, you go down from 99 or 100% to whatever, and then what happens?
Exactly. I think what's important, though, especially from a company perspective, not in politics, but well, also, but if you start to see dissent, and this is maybe also something to look at, you know, for anybody that's listening, is if you receive dissent, and it can be, you know, like we discussed, it could be like in a way positive dissent, just because somebody had a different opinion or somebody has got a guideline and you're not disclosing this, and you're listening to it and you are understanding why this was. And you're telling the shareholder that, you know, thank you very much for your vote, but you know, I also understand where you're coming from, and this was your opinion. What's very important is that this is actually eventually acknowledged, that you actually reach out and that you say, hey, Klaus, why did you vote against me? Actually, tell me about it, right? If I meet you, and you say, you know what, I didn't like the way that the board is set up, or something like this, and then I understand. I think what a lot of companies are doing, and this is not just in Germany, but across the world, is the dissent can sometimes spectacularly go down, and it can be further and further and further, and all of a sudden you start to see the dissent not just on the one item, but then also on the discharge of the supervisory board. It's in particular if we're talking about the remuneration systems here, for example, right, and the remuneration reports, the votes. If there is a certain amount of dissent, it means that shareholders have certain topics with it that they're not satisfied about. And if the company just lets that go and puts it back to the vote the next year, having not done any engagement with the shareholders, what tends to happen, and you can read this in the guidelines of BlackRock as well as Glass Lewis and Vanguard, is if you haven't engaged with your shareholders, the next time round, if I haven't heard from you, I'm going to vote against your discharge as well. And so then
and that's fine, and that's completely fine. And I think that was another thing I learned now, being more or less new in the whole investor arena. We have made the biggest dissent of the last year's shareholder meeting part of our roadshow. I mean, that was the number one topic in the roadshow. Of course, nothing else makes any sense. I mean, if that's the concern of anybody, then we need to talk about it, and we need to make sure that the next time we have a better approach.
Absolutely. I think I've got one last question here, and then we're going to have to come to the end of this, Klaus. So somebody's asking here, what other topics have you seen for the AGM season 2023? It can't be only ESG. I'm just reading it out directly from what has been written. In terms of ESG, I think the governance part is part of ES and G, but maybe I can just quickly highlight some of the things that I have seen have received at least special attention already this year, and also maybe some of the guidelines that have been changed to reflect this from the investor perspective. So I spoke about it a little bit at the beginning of this session. One of them is the board independence levels, as well as now committees. Committees have to be independent enough. Committee independence is then criticized. If it's not independent enough, it's criticized at the discharge level. So you'll see this sort of thing happening. In terms of the remuneration report, dissenting votes, we just talked about it. If you haven't responded to any dissent that's more than 20%, so it's usually the number is 80%. Some investors already have 75%. If you haven't received those voting, those supportive votes, and you haven't engaged with shareholders, it is very likely that those shareholders will vote against the discharge of the supervisory board in 2023. So something to be looking out for. The other thing that we have seen, of course, is the virtual shareholder meetings. So it's the introduction of this into the articles of association. There is some dissent here, like we say, it's not something that's necessarily negative, but you need to watch out for that. And I think that is really it. Also, in terms of guideline changes, we haven't seen anything major relating to capital. We haven't seen anything major relating to anything else. So I think those are the three biggest topics for Germany for 2023. At least that's my advice at this moment in time. We have only had a few shareholder meetings, so there's a lot more to come. I don't know, Klaus, if you have any advice for anybody before we close?
I mean, just to add on top, each company has its specific challenges and controversials, maybe open litigations, all these type of things. Of course, they will pop up very high. And then the advice is what we have already discussed. Engage before engage, and show that you are taking action in a credible way, in a transparent manner. I think also important in that phase of ESG, again, just a quick look on ESG again, is it's not necessary to have millions of additional commitments at this point of time. What matters is execution. Demonstrate execution on your promises. I think that's at the moment the most important thing, probably beyond ESG.
I think on that, we're going to close the webinar. I thank you so much, Klaus, for joining me. It's been a really cool conversation. I've never had a webinar like this before, and I think I'm going to have some more like this. It was a lovely chat. And like I said earlier at the beginning of this webinar as well, if there's any questions that are unanswered, we'll answer them just after this session. But thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, that's it from my side.
Thank you, Angelika. Next time I will try to interview you. We just do it.
Yes, let's do that.
It's really nice. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody listening, and thank you. Bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.